The crimes committed during World War II have been etched into the collective conscience, from executions, atrocious scientific experiments, to mass genocide in concentration camps. However, there are facts that were omitted from some historical accounts for many years. During that dark period, thousands of women suffered sexual abuse, violent and heartbreaking, which not only aimed to take over their bodies, but also completely undermined their ideology and fighting spirit. There is no distinction between sides here. Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and the United States are all equally guilty. The weight of that guilt must fall on each one. Perhaps the books do not tell you about these women, but through this new military history video, we are going to learn in detail the most horrific and abominable sexual crimes committed during World War II. Let's begin. In 1933, the Nazi Party came to power led by Adolf Hitler, giving way to a dark and disastrous period in Germany. Soon after, the dreaded concentration camps began to be built to contain the so-called enemies of the state. However, this quickly spread to the Jewish people, who went through one of the most terrifying genocides in human history. The community was the victim of a wave of unbridled hatred, mistreatment, and abuse for more than a decade, which left an indelible stigma on its history.
¡Quítate el vestido! ¡Tira la ropa al suelo!
¿Qué es eso? ¡Quítatelo! Déjame ayudar.
¡Quiero que lo hagas rápido!
¡Háganlo más rápido! ¡Son unas tontas!
¡Fuera! ¡Por aquí! ¡Fuera! ¡Que se salgan! ¡Fuera!
¡Fuera!
¡Marchando! ¡Que salgas de aquí! ¡Fuera! ¡Fuera!
¡Vamos, vamos! ¡Salgan! ¡Vamos, todas ustedes!
Despite the growing interest in women's experiences during the Holocaust, sexual violence remains one of the least explored topics, but it also echoes other atrocities experienced during the war. Lack of food was one of the measures with which the Nazis punished prisoners. Daily rations were minimal, and they lived with an agonizing feeling of hunger. Both leaders and guards often took advantage of this and coerced women and girls into having sex in exchange for food and medicine, or simply under threat of death. But this was only the starting point for one of the horrors sheltered under the Nazi flag, and that few of us know about. Heinrich Himmler, second in command of the Third Reich. Attending to the physical needs of men, and in order to keep them happy, insisted on establishing brothels both inside and outside the concentration camps. It is known that between 300 and 400 women were forced into prostitution in Auschwitz, Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsen, among others. Although the real number is unknown, there were 3 different types of brothels, one for prisoners, one for soldiers, and one for SS officers, where they sent those they considered most attractive. The inmates were offered an incentive program to work hard, for which they would then be rewarded with female company for 15 minutes. It was a humiliating situation, and indisputable proof that the Nazis always maintained power, both over the inmates and over the victims sexually exploited by their own fellow captives. Of course, the same racist laws of Nazi Germany were followed in the establishment of these brothels, and Jews were forbidden access. So the women who were there were mostly Germans who had been arrested for prostitution or for being related to those known as enemies of the Reich. The cynicism of the regime was at its most extreme, since on the one hand it was against the oldest profession in the world, and they arrested those who practiced it, and then sexually enslaved them with total impunity. These brothels also contained Spanish prisoners who, after the civil war in their country, were transferred to a Nazi concentration camp where they were forced to prostitute themselves. The Spanish writer and historian Fermina Cañaveras, in her new book El Barracón de las Mujeres, The Women's Barracks, seeks to rescue part of these stories that were lost over the years. From the crude account that emerges, we are going to hear this brief fragment. When my turn came, I lay down on the stretcher, spread my trembling legs, and covered my eyes with my hands. I did not want to look. I felt something cold in my vagina, cold and hard. It reached my insides, and immediately, a prick. I had no idea what they had just injected me with. I did not know what the liquid they put inside me was for. For a few moments, I thought it was to kill me, but it did not make much sense. They had not cut my hair like the others. The crows were not so considerate with someone who was going to die. They had already shown me that with my mother. I did not stop crying during the examination. Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger did not care why I was crying. He was too busy with my vagina. For him, my productivity came first. He cared little about anything else. The moment that the book portrays with stark honesty is the examination that every woman had to go through before being taken to one of those brothels. It is not unusual to suppose that the protagonist, at that moment, when she closed her eyes, was transported far away from there to the middle of the sea. But in times of war, the waves can never be calm. Generally, when we talk about the Holocaust, it is easy to distinguish between perpetrators and victims. However, some cases of wartime violence blur these lines to such an extent that identification becomes confusing. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, France, and other countries crossed the English Channel, launching one of the largest amphibious and airborne invasions in history. It was codenamed Operation Overlord, better known as D-Day. It marked the beginning of a long and costly campaign to liberate northwestern Europe from Nazi occupation. That is at least the official version. However, what we are going to learn about next is a fact so aberrant that for decades the United States and France have chosen to bury it in oblivion. Mass rapes of women, even in public spaces, the trophy that American soldiers believed was rightfully theirs. Robert Lilly and Mary Louise Roberts, two American historians, decided to remove the veil and write a book about what happened. Among their focus of analysis, they try to explain the cliches that the American imagination had impregnated in the brains of its combatants. France was presented in the military magazine Stars and Stripes as a great house of prostitutes, an eroticized country whose women were beautiful, welcoming, and demonstrative. These stereotypes had already been generated among veterans of the First World War, whose exaggerated erotic adventures in France were passed down from generation to generation. With these lustful ideas, American soldiers landed in Normandy, convinced that French women were an easy prize to obtain. Despite the zeal with which the powers tried to bury what happened, historians managed to find records of the first incident of sexual violence that occurred just 2 months after the landing. The perpetrators were not soldiers on the front line, but members of logistical support units, who, not being directly involved in combat, had more free time and less strict discipline once the workday was over. But unfortunately, it was not the only case they found. Dozens of mass rapes of French women had been reported, some of them minors. For these men, it was not a way to humiliate the enemy or punish a people resistant to the invader, but rather a reward for their work. From 1944 to 1945, American military courts installed in French territory tried 139 soldiers for these crimes. Of these, 68 were sentenced to life imprisonment and 22 to death. The figure may seem small, but it is important to understand that it is only the official number and covers only a period of 1 year. Of course, historians Robert Lilly and Mary Louise Roberts add that there must be many other victims who never filed a complaint. The relatives of these women still make a great effort to accept that most of the soldiers were only trying to put an end to Hitler's tyranny. The rest is just a dark episode straight out of a horror movie. But just as we mentioned at the beginning, in this matter no one is free from sin. The Soviet Union was a key piece in the fall of Berlin. On January 12, 1945, the Red Army entered German territory and advanced westward at high speed. They managed to penetrate into Prussia and eastern Pomerania to temporarily stop 60 kilometers east of Berlin in a defensive line along the Oder River. This would be the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany, which culminated in the battle that ended on May 2nd of the same year, when the Germans surrendered the city to the Red Army. This was just days after Adolf Hitler committed suicide. Just as Soviet soldiers moved into the territory, they did so with the bodies of German women. During their time there, the worst sexual atrocities were reported.
Then they came downstairs to the basement, putting this cardboard on the table, telling the people in Berlin, Väterchen Stalin gave his troops the right to rape, to steal, to kill, to do whatever they want to do. And believe me, they did.
The testimony we have just heard is that of Lisa Saltar, a Protestant woman who served as a teletypist for the German army in World War II. During the invasion of the Soviet Union, she and hundreds of other women were cannon fodder for the Red Army, used not only as a war tactic, but also as a means of punishment and revenge on their people. There are numerous records of rapes committed by Russian troops from different sources, Soviet and German military reports, to first-hand testimonies from soldiers and women alike. We will now hear another part of Lisa's chilling account, which speaks for itself.
And they didn't take her outside the basement. They put her against the wall, and they stood in line with their machine gun pointing at us and raped the woman. And they were not 18 years or 19 or nobody looked good. I mean, you didn't want to look good.
Medical records from Berlin hospitals estimated that between 95,000 and 130,000 women were raped, approximately 6% of the female population. The Red Army had surrounded itself with an aura of terror, with its brutal and relentless attacks on all ages, from girls as young as 8 to old women as old as 80. Moreover, the rapes were repeated and planned to the point that one woman was abused numerous times by multiple soldiers. Let us review an absolutely deplorable figure. At least 860,000 women and girls were victims of rape during World War II. These acts of sexual violence are not limited only to members of the American military, but also include the Soviet force, instigated by Stalin. To this day, this topic remains a great taboo for Russia. Its specialized media often dismiss mass abuse as Western myths. It is difficult to determine how Russian women were treated by soldiers. Most did not survive the occupation. Perhaps the only physical evidence we can find is on display at the German-Russian Museum in Berlin, a photograph taken in Crimea by a Nazi soldier, showing the corpse of a young woman lying on the ground. It appears that she was not only murdered but also raped. Her skirt is pulled up and her hands cover her face. But why have these crimes not received the same attention as other aspects of World War II? Shame plays a crucial role in the silence, not only on the part of the victims of such atrocities, but in the carefully constructed narrative by the Allies, who took pains to portray Germany and its citizens as solely responsible for the horrors of the conflict. Beyond the context and the political interests that ran through that era, leaving aside territories and nationalities, it was just about men exercising their natural strength to abuse women in a clearly disadvantaged condition. No one could or wanted to deal with that at the time. The version was always told from the soldiers' side. Exiles, wars, death. But what about them? History owes recognition to those who experienced the pain firsthand. In the meantime, we contribute our grain of sand. With this, we conclude today's installment. We hope you found it revealing. We encourage you to subscribe and activate notifications so you don't miss our next military history publications. See you in the next video.